An Acceptable Time by Madeleine L'Engle, Chapter 6. The silence in the kitchen was broken by Dr. Louise drumming on the table. Mr. Murray put a bowl of food by the pantry door. "Are you sure?" The bishop rubbed his eyes. "I could be wrong." Hadron, asleep on his scrap of rug, watched with one suspicious eye. The dog ate hungrily but tidily. When it was finished, Hadron minced over to inspect the bowl, licking it for possible crumbs while the dog stood wagging its long tail. Mrs. Murray took an old blanket out of the garage. "He can stay there for tonight. If he's a dog from 3,000 years ago, I don't want him to..." Her voice trailed off. Dr. Louise laughed. "If he's from 3,000 years ago, do you think keeping him either in or out of the house would make any difference?" Mrs. Murray was chagrined. "You're right, of course, but somehow I feel he's freer to come and go if he's outside. For tonight, at any rate. Tomorrow we'll see. This evening we're going to sit around the table and eat a civilized meal with a very nice glass of Burgundy." She washed her hands. "All right, we're ready. Let's gather round." The kitchen curtains were drawn across the long expanse of windows. The fire in the open hearth crackled pleasantly. The aroma of Mrs. Murray's casserole was tantalizing. It should have been a normal, pleasant evening, but it wasn't. "Bishop, tell us about the dog, please," Polly asked. He lifted his glass of wine so that the light touched the liquid and it shone like a ruby. "I'm getting old, I'm not sure. I'm probably wrong. But Corrales has a dog like that." "Yes," Polly agreed. "The first time I saw Corrales by the big oak, there was a dog with him." "Was it that dog?" her grandfather demanded. "That kind with big ears tipped with black? You're sure Corrales has a dog?" "Yes, why?" the bishop asked. "It just seems very unlikely. 3,000 years ago, there were very few domesticated dogs. There were wolves and dog wolves, but domesticated dogs were just beginning to be mentioned in Egypt. We don't know exactly how long ago Corrales lived. 3,000 years ago is just a convenient guess. Anyhow, how do you know?" "I'm a fund of useless information." "Not so useless," his wife said. "That dog appears to have no wolf blood. It's unlikely your Corrales would have a dog like this. Unless," the bishop said, "he brought him to the New World with him." "What's all the fuss?" Dr. Louise raised her eyebrows. "If you're seeing people from 3,000 years ago, why get so excited about a dog?" "It's one more thing," the bishop said. "I think it's a sign." "Of what?" His sister sounded impatient. I know, Louise, it's against all your training, but you did take care of Annie. You have to admit that. I took care of a girl whose badly lacerated finger needed immediate attention. She wasn't that different from all the other fallen sparrows you seem to think it's your duty to rescue." "Louise," Mrs. Murray said, "I find it hard to believe that Nays actually brought Annerl to your office and that you treated her as an ordinary person." "As an ordinary person," Dr. Louise said firmly. "Whether or not the girl whose finger I took care of was from 3,000 years ago or not, I have no idea." "You told me to take her back," the bishop said. "To wherever, whenever." "Louise, it all started in your root cellar with the first Ogham stone." "I'm only a simple Episcopalian," Dr. Louise said. "This is too much for me." "You aren't a simple anything, that's your problem." The bishop looked over at the Ogham stones on the dresser. "And noting the fall of the sparrow is an activity not unknown to you, Louise. Maybe you should come to the star-watching rock with me. Maybe if you cross the time threshold." Dr. Louise shook her head. "No, thanks." The bishop's plate was empty, and he took a large helping from the bowl Mrs. Murray held out. The quantity of food he managed to put away seemed in direct disproportion to his long thinness. "This is marvelous, Kate, and the wine." "You don't drink this wine every night." Mr. Murray refilled the bishop's glass. "All in your honor." The bishop took an appreciative sip. "The words on the Ogham stones, if I have deciphered them correctly, are peaceable, gentle, memorial markers, and occasionally something that sounds like part of a rune. The one Polly carried in for me, for instance. Like the song of our sisters, the stars sing our hearts to, and there it breaks off. Isn't it beautiful? But alas, in Annie's time, as now, sacred things were not always honored. Words, runes, for instance, were sometimes missed. They were meant to bless, but they were sometimes called on for curses, and they were used to influence weather, fertility, human love. Yes, runes were sometimes abused, but it was never forgotten that they had power." "You're lecturing again," his sister commented. But Polly, interested, said, "You mean The old rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me, is wrong. The bishop agreed. Totally. Mrs. Murray pushed her chair back slightly, and Hadron, taking this as an invitation, left his place by the hearth and jumped into her lap. The bishop continued. That little rhyme doesn't take into account that words have power, intrinsic power. I love you. What could be more powerful than that small trinity? On the other hand, malicious gossip can cause horrible damage, Mr. Murray said. If Dr. Louise tells me I look awful, my joints are going to feel hot and inflamed. Whereas happily I can say you're doing very well indeed, Dr. Louise said. Swimming definitely helps, Mr. Murray said, but we do respond to suggestions. Dr. Louise pursued her own train of thought. I'm an internist, not a cardiologist, but I'd like to have a look at Zachary. I thought he seemed a charming young man, and I don't like the sound of this. He's coming over on Saturday, Polly said. I'd like you to see him too, Dr. Louise. I really would. Is he a special friend of yours? She asked. He's a friend. I don't know him that well. I don't even know him well enough to know whether or not he's likely to exaggerate. I know he was scared. One of the Ogham stones, the bishop frowned slightly, remembering, goes, from frights and fears may we be spared by breath of wind and quiet and rain. Is a rune a sort of prayer? Polly asked. If one truly believes in prayer, yes. Like the Tallis Canon, she suggested. All praise to thee, my God, this night, the bishop nodded, for all the blessings of the light. Yes, of course. And then there's let all mortal flesh keep silent. Oh, indeed, yes. Mrs. Murray brought the salad bowl to the table. What a conversation for a group of pragmatic scientists, with the exception of you, Nays. Alas, Bishop Kalubra took a piece of bread and wiped up his gravy. Bishops all too often limit themselves to the pragmatic. And there are times when pragmatism is essential. The trouble is that then we tend to forget that there's anything else. But there is, isn't there? Louise, even in the most pragmatic of sciences. Louise has a fine reputation as a diagnostician, Mrs. Murray said. And, am I right, Louise? Her diagnoses are made not only from observation and information and knowledge, but also on a hunch. Dr. Louise agreed. Intuition, the bishop smiled at his sister. The understanding of the heart rather than the mind. You were always wise, big brother. Dr. Louise suddenly sounded wistful. You were the one I could always turn to for a reason when things got out of hand. And now, I'd think you'd gone completely off your rocker if these eminently sane people sitting around the table didn't take you seriously. And Polly, who strikes me as a most sensible person, is having the same hallucinations that you are. Mass hallucinations through two people are hardly a mass, Mrs. Murray said. It is a possibility, but not a likelihood. I wish I didn't feel so outraged, Dr. Louise apologized. It's making me inordinately grumpy. When Nays brought Annie to me, did I just move into his hallucination? If it weren't for that possibility, I could wipe the whole thing out and return to my rational world. Mr. Murray took a casserole to the counter and brought back a bowl of fruit. I couldn't eat another thing, Polly said. Not even an apple. Anyhow, I like our funny-looking gnarled ones better than these pretty ones. The bishop reached into the bowl and helped himself. No one wanted coffee, and Dr. Louise rose and announced that it was time to go home. Polly and her grandparents went outdoors to give the Kalubras the traditional farewell. The northwest wind was cold, but the sky was high and clear, the stars dazzling like diamonds. The Milky Way streamed its distant river across the sky. The bishop raised his face to the starlight. How many millions of years are we seeing, Alex? Many. What is the nearest star? Proxima Centauri, about 4 light years away. And how many miles? Oh, about 23 million miles. The bishop's breath was cloudy in the light over the garage door. Look at that star just overhead. We're seeing it in time as well as space, time long gone. We don't know what that star looks like now, or even if it's still there. It could have become a supernova, or collapsed in on itself and become a black hole. How extraordinary to be looking at a star in this present moment and seeing it millions of years ago. Dr. Louise took her brother's arm affectionately. Enough fantasizing, Nays. Is it? but he got into the car behind the steering wheel. Louise shows both courage and trust to let Nason drive, Mrs. Murray murmured. Dr. Louise, getting into the passenger seat, laughed. He used to fly a lot, too. Terrifying thought, Mrs. Murray said, as they waved as the bishop took off in a cloud of dust. And we'll pause there.